effects on the two acute problems of the world, including India, that is poverty and inequality. And as of course, we know as teachers of economics, the climate change has a wide range of impacts on the economy, economic growth, economic development. And also, of course, it has its impact on many sectors of the, say, the economy also. And related to poverty and inequality, and linking the changes that has been happening in the world related to global warming. So from our knowledge, we were noted that there are several reasons for poverty and inequality. But here, the discussion is not related to those causes for poverty and inequality. And of course, the poverty is also a one type of inequality. But the purpose of this discussion is to identify the nexus between the changes in climate and how that climate change exacerbating the poverty and inequality in the world. The impact of climate change on the countries across the, of course, across the countries of the world and within the country, across the regions within the country, and also peoples and across the peoples, the effect or the impact of the climate change is not proportionate, not identical or similar. So the climate change has disproportionate impact on the economic growth and economic development at the world level, across the countries, within the country, and also that is applicable to people and across the peoples. So hence the focus of this first session is how the climate change exacerbates the poverty and inequality. And as I have told you earlier, the climate change is one of the reasons, one of the causes for both poverty and inequality, but the other causes, the reasons for these two acute problems of the world are not discussed under this session. So how the climate change impact on the poverty and inequality in the world is the focus of the today's session, or the first session in the afternoon. The climate change is accelerating environmental degradation, okay, and increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, among other impacts. The effects of both gradual environmental degradation and sudden shocks such as hurricanes and floods disproportionately affect vulnerable population. So if we take into account or consider how this environmental or the climate change in terms of environmental degradation effects on the population or the countries. So the climate change has a gradual impact on the economic development and growth of the nations, and also it has unforeseen sudden shocks appears in such as hurricanes and floods. And the effect of this sudden shocks of the climate change, or even the gradual impact of this climate change, is not proportionate. And proportionate in the sense that its impact on the peoples and the countries. So hence it is a disproportionately effect on the, more specifically, the vulnerable populations. And this kind of effect, whether effects impinge on infrastructure, livelihood, resources, health, or even the loss of lives and homes. These impacts are by no means uniform across countries or population groups. So the impact of this climate change is not uniform, either it's intrude or the impact or the impinge type of effect of this on the above said say the factors is not uniform or the proportionate. So hence so we need to study, we need to examine what kind of disproportionate effect the climate change has on vulnerable population. And also we were noted that rising temperatures have adversely affected economic growth in countries located in the tropics, which tend to be poorer than countries located in more temperate climate zones. So even in case of the zonal distribution of the countries, or in case of spheres, northern sphere or southern spheres, the land, okay, the effect of this climate change is not same. And this changes in the climate have made the world's poorest countries poorer. The ratio between the income of the richest and the poorest 10% of the global population is 25% larger than it would be in a world without global warming. So this is the estimation or the calculation by one of the study. Say it is 1/4 of the difference, okay, in the richest and the poorest income groups is 1/4, that is 25%. So it is due to because of the climate change. If there would be no climate change or global warming, so say the 25% of the gap in the income between the richest and poorest 10% not be found and unaddressed. So if these effects of the climate change across the people, across the countries, or the regions within a country is not addressed, then the climate change may even reverse the current progress in reducing poverty and inequality among the countries. So that's why there is a need to address this global warming problem, climate change problem. So if that is not done by the world or the countries of the world, so that reverse the current progress that has been made by most of the countries in the world in reducing poverty and inequality. So hence there is an urgent need to address this problem of climate change. And related to say the impact, one more impact other than that income related effects, and in 2010 deaths resulting from this climate change were estimated at 4 lakh. By the end of this century, this number may increase to 1.5 million per year if the rate of emission remains unchanged. So almost, let us just take, that is the just 4 lakh in 2010. So in the next, okay, almost say 80 years, if the climate change has continued in the same proportion, or the emissions are not reduced, if the emissions remained unchanged, so the number of the deaths due to because of the climate change that will increase to 1.5 million. So this was estimated by Climate Impact Lab in 2018. Assessing the impact of climate change on displacement in challenging. It is a challenging. So it is very difficult to assess the impact of say the climate change in displacement. So the climate change, as I earlier told you, that it has a wide range of effect on the economies of the world or the countries of the world, not just on income, not just on the health related aspects. It also affect on the displacement of the people. That leads to migration also. However, one estimate puts the number of the people forced to move as a result of weather events, and the natural disasters at an average of 24.1 million people per year from 2008 to 2018. 18. So in this 11 years per year, it was estimated to around, that is around 24 million people are displaced due to because of the climate change, like due to because of floods and other related natural disasters. So in the 20 years between 1998 to 2017, losses from this extreme weather events or the climate change events amounted to an estimated $174 billion annually. So this is the loss due to because of the climate change in the world. As climate change progresses, these losses are expected to rise and will increase the severity unless urgent climate action is taken. So if the action is not taken to reduce the emissions, might be that is one of the most important cause for this global warming and other related climate change aspects. So hence the world will loses so much more compared to the current estimates by the different studies. So this is one of the information which we have obtained for the World Bank estimations. So it has selected few countries related to the shocks faced by the countries or the households in the country faced by different shocks. So just observe this out of these 6 countries. The first shocks mentioned by the household is related to natural disasters. So for example, if you take India, 57% of the households in that study, they were mentioned that the natural disaster is the first shock they faces, and others are price shocks, employment shock, health related shocks, personal and property crime, and so on. But out of this, in all these 6 countries, Afghanistan, India, Laos, PDR, Malawi, Peru, and Uganda, in all these countries, say the highest number of the households they are opined, it was a natural disaster. And even if you observe across these selected 6 countries, for example, so highest is in case of India, that is 57.3% of the households they are opined that so it is the natural disasters. So that shows the severity of this climate change or global warming. And this bar diagram that represent or indicates the losses by the country income group between 1998 to 2017. Earlier, of course, we are noted. So this diagram, depicts both absolute amount of the loss and the percentage of GDP across the regions. That is high income, upper middle income, low income countries, and lower middle income countries, and the low income countries. So just though, of course, the in terms of absolute value, though the income countries loss is higher like 1,432 billion dollars, but in terms of the percentage of the GDP, it is just 0.41. But whereas in case of the low or middle income and the low income countries, so almost just observe that 3 to 4 times higher in terms of their percentage of the GDP. That's why so the climate change, global warming, disproportionately affect on the people at the household level, but at the country level also. The poorer countries are the worst, of course, hit by this global warming or the climate change. This is one more evidence related to the impact of global warming or the climate change related to the income and poverty rates. So this diagram indicates without environmental income, poverty rates would be much higher in subtropical forest landscapes, Latin America, South Asia, East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and that is the total is the last bar. So here only the tropical, subtropical forest areas have been taken, or the landscape has been taken. So in all these countries, just observe that, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, nearly 60%, okay, 60% of the poverty rate is higher if you take with environment effect. That is, if the environmental effect in earning income has been taken into consideration and calculated the impact of environment on earnings, income earnings, so nearly 60% of the poverty has been higher if that is included. So that's why. So if a country or the vulnerable people, if they more depends upon the environmental related activities or the ecosystems, so then they are most worst affected countries at the country level, or the peoples at the household level. And that is related to across the countries. And from that discussion, what we have learned, that the effect of the climate change is disproportionate, not identical. The most worst, okay, affected countries by the estimates that has observed that, so they are the poor countries. But whereas within the country, the people living in poverty and other disadvantaged groups, including indigenous peoples and the small landholders, are disproportionately exposed to climate change. So within the country also, the effect of the climate change is not proportionate, not equal. It has a disproportionate impact or the effect on, more specifically, the poorer people. The majority of the people in these groups live in rural areas and are highly dependent on agriculture. In one of the previous graph, we have noted that so the most worst affected, okay, the persons are living in rural areas, and since they are depends upon the agriculture, and the most important or most worst sector, that is the sector which is most affected by the climate change, is agriculture, fishing, and other ecosystem related income. So their lives and livelihoods are finely attuned to environmental conditions that are now changing rapidly. So that's why it is very difficult even to say forecast, predict regarding the effect of the climate change. The people living in poverty are also more affected by infectious and respiratory diseases that climate change will aggravate. So the climate change just not impact on the income, not impact on the agriculture sector, not impact on the other aspect, that also impact or effect on the health related aspects, as earlier we have noted that. Similarly, they are more susceptible to damage from climate change than their richer counterparts living in the same region. The poor people are more vulnerable, more susceptible to the damage from this climate change. And finally, they have fewer resources to help them cope with and recover from both the sudden and slow onset of effects of climate change. So, and the people who are vulnerable in a country, so they have, of course, not say any resources to cope up with that particular environmental problem and also recover from the sudden cause of this effect. So that's why even for recovering that problem which they have faced due to because of floods or due to because of other natural disasters, so it is also very difficult for them because they have fewer resources. And as just we have noted that the agriculture sector is the most worst affected sectors of the economy due to because of this climate change that has been observed from this. So again, there are several simulations have been conducted by the studies related to the impact of climate change. Based on that, if the prosperity scenario and the prosperity scenario is high impact, prosperity scenario is low impact, related also to poverty scenario with high impact poverty and the low impact poverty scenario. Just if you observe the low, that is the high impact poverty scenario, so there is, if this red, okay, this the red part of this bar that represent agriculture, and the second highest effect that sector will be the health sector, then the labor productivity and the disasters. That's why, so this estimate or the forecast of the climate change and its effect on the different sectors, the most affected sector is agriculture. And those are all, of course, related to the world level impact of climate change and its impact on the different sectors of the economy, including agricultural sector. So this is a projection by one of the study is related to Indian context, projected physical and economic impacts of the climate change in India. So the impact on rainfall pattern, impact on temperature, impact on sea level, and other natural disasters like storms and cyclones. So in all these cases, for example, if you take the rainfall pattern, an extra 2 heat waves, so that is 12 to 18 day at a high temperature each year by 2064. So, and in case of sea level, that rises at the end of the century by 20 to 30 cm. So the temperature also will increases. So related to the direct effect of this climate change on the economic aspects, so the GDP in 2100 to be reduced by 10% if the temperature is at 3%, 3 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius. If it is, for example, the temperature is less than, okay, the 2 degrees Celsius, so the GDP decline by around, okay, so say 2.6%. But if the temperature increases by an amount of 4 degrees Celsius, okay, the expected reduction in the GDP is 13.4%. So this projection shows us that just because of okay, the climate change, the Indian GDP decreased by so 10% and up to 13.4%. So if the temperature is around increases in 2100 by 10% and 13% respectively. So these okay, estimates or the study shows us that so the climate change is affecting both the prevalence and the depth of the poverty, thereby contributing to inequality. It is making it harder for people to escape poverty and is increasing their vulnerability to falling into poverty, and due to price shocks caused by sudden changes in agriculture production, natural disasters, environmentally triggered health problems. And related to the estimates, so if the mitigation and adaptation strategies are successful, between 3 million to 16 million people will fall into poverty by 2030 because of the climate change. And under high impact scenario, those figures could rise between 35 million to 122 million. So that is, so it is due to because of the climate change. So even the countries of the world, if they mitigate this problem of climate change and adopted various strategies to control the emissions and so on. So even then, so the poverty as increases. So that is 3 million to 16 million people will fall into poverty trap because of just climate change. In the high scenario means, so that is if the temperature increases by 4 degrees Celsius, so that could rise the people fall into poverty between 35 million to 122 million. So that's why these through estimates that shows us the severity of the people that fall into poverty. There is one study by Krishna related to Andhra Pradesh in 2010 around. He was conducted impact of climate change on poverty, and he was estimated the dynamic concepts of the poverty, the dynamic concept of the poverty, and its results showed that. So in case of Andhra Pradesh, so it is okay, because of the various programs of the government, the poverty has been reduced by 10%. But because of these climate related problems, because of the global warming, 14% of the observations, or the 14% of the respondents of that study, okay, fall into poverty. The net effect is, though according to the reports of the government, so the 10% of the peoples are so out of poverty because of the program. But because of this climate change, so 14% or fall within the poverty, the net effect is actually 2% of the people, they are falling to poverty. So that is called as dynamic poverty. So in estimation and in computation of the poverty, so just we need not to focus on how many people are so above the poverty line. So that the simultaneously at the same time, because of this climate change and also because of other reasons, some of the people who are at the edge of that poverty line may come into the poverty. Then the climate change is also having an impact on intergenerational inequality. So that's why when I started my discussion, I have told you that please mute your gadgets. Okay. So as I have told you that is the climate change has a wide range of impacts. One among them is intergenerational inequality. That is the inequality that has been created by the climate change, not related to this current generation, but also that creates or impact and creates the inequality among the generations. The disruptions caused by climate change are likely to reduce the livelihood opportunities of the future generations, especially in the countries hardest hit, and exacerbate the downward intergenerational mobility. So that's why the climate change also has intergenerational impacts. And indeed, the effects of the climate change are not uniform in their reach and magnitude, nor are the abilities of the countries and the communities to cope and respond. The most severe impact of the climate change to date have been in tropical regions where most developing countries are located. If you just observe the history of impact of the climate change, that is the most developing countries were the hard hit regions of the world, because any climate change, global warming, and its impact is first probably is on this developing countries, since they are located in the tropical regions. Such impacts are expected to become more intense. These countries often have little capacity to recover on their own, and losses from climate hazards can hamper and even reverse the years of development efforts. So from the last 60 or 70 years, the most of the developing countries have made some effort to increase their level of development. So but because of this climate change, that effort by these countries would be reversed. So this is the opinion of the many studies, if the climate change is unaddressed. Countries in the Caribbean, for example, are severely affected by climate change events such as hurricanes, with Dominica, Antigua, and Barbuda suffering damages estimated at 46% and 215% of GDP, respectively, in 2017 and at the end of the century. So because of that hurricanes, so in these countries in the Caribbean regions, so let us just observe that value. 46% of the GDP is destructed because of the climate change in 2017 itself. That it is 215% at the end of the century if this climate problem is unaddressed. In developing and developed countries alike, persons who are disadvantaged or whose livelihoods are reliant on climate sensitive resources are disproportionately affected. So as earlier we have noted that this not just affects on the countries, but also the peoples within the countries, and within the country, as already noted, that hardest hit peoples are the disadvantaged groups. The people living in poverty are more frequently exposed to climate hazards than their wealthier counterparts. They also tend to lose relatively more when affected, as do small older farmers, rural coastal populations, and indigenous people. Having suffered setbacks such as livelihood losses or deteriorating health from climate hazards, those who are disadvantaged may have few resources to enable them to cope and recover. So this is just an introduction to this talk, and the focus of this talk is related to nexus between the inequality, poverty with climate change, or how the effects of climate change can exacerbate the inequality and poverty. Under that, this focuses on outlining the linkages between climate change with these two problems, and also try to illustrate how climate change can increase inequality across the countries through varying effects in different geographic regions and by level of income. And the next examines how climate change is linked to inequality within countries, describing how particular challenges encountered by the people specifically living in poverty. And finally, of course, based on the studies, okay, so we will have policy implications at the end. The first subtopic is related to linkages or the links between climate change and inequality and poverty. This link can be studied with the channels through which climate impacts are felt, and the second is determinants of how these impacts are experienced by different people or groups. So the channels through which the climate change impact on the people, and the second one is, so what are the determinants this climate change as a disproportionate impact. That's why the focus of this talk is related to disproportionate effect of climate change. So because of the poverty and inequality aspects. Then the channels through which climate change exert its effect, whether they are immediate or pan out over time. Climate change impacts are felt both directly and indirectly on livelihoods, health and mortality, agriculture and food prices, and labor productivity. So the major, the sectors are the major factors which are directly and indirectly influenced by, affected by the climate change are livelihoods, health and mortality, agriculture, food prices, and the labor productivity. So now let us take these 5 sectors which are affected by the climate change, and then we call this as, these are the 5 important channels through which the climate change exerts its impact on the peoples or the countries. The first one is livelihoods. Climate change has a direct impact on assets and the resources needed to earn a living. The destruction of homes and infrastructure, degradation of the ecological resources, and the loss of biodiversity affects all. But the wealth of those in poverty is more likely to be concentrated in material forms such as housing or livestock, and their assets are more fragile. So why the poor people, why the small old land owners are affected? Because the most of their resource is concentrated in material form. So this material form wealth is destructed because of the climate change. So because of this reason, so the hardest hit is observed for this group of people. In addition to that, the environmental damage severely harms livelihood that are climate sensitive, including agriculture and fishing. Okay, because these two the activities are highly depends upon the climate. The erosion of the natural assets can force those reliant on them for their livelihoods to seek other sources of income, such as by shifting from crop-based to hybrid livestock-based agriculture or wage labor employment. That's why. So because of this loss, because of the climate change in agriculture and fishing, so they have to change their crop, shift their crop, or also they turn to be the wage earners, or to find wage labor employment in agriculture or in other sectors. Outcomes can be particularly disastrous when climate hazards occurs quick succession, leaving the little time for those already afflicted to recover, adjust, and rebuild their assets and livelihood. So if this climate change and the effect of that climate hazard occur in quick succession, so it is very difficult for these types of people who depends upon agriculture, who depends upon fishing, and the poor people. So there is no time for them to recover or readjust or rebuild their assets and livelihoods. That's why the first channel through which this climate change directly effect on the countries and the people is livelihood. Then the second one is health and mortality. That is the second channel through which the climate change effects on the human being or the countries. The changes in temperature and the occurrence of the heat waves, droughts, floods, among other extreme events because of the climate change also affects human health and mortality, with the greatest burden expected to fall on lower income countries. Extreme temperatures, for instance, aggravate cardiovascular and respiratory disease and increase mortality. This is the study by UNSFCC in 2017. Fluctuating and increased precipitation level, comprise of freshwater supplies, and rise in the risk of diarrhea, waterborne illness and diseases transmitted through insects and animals. So if there is a heavy rain, if there is a precipitation or heavy rains because of this, so there are several health related diseases caused. Then changing climatic conditions will not only lengthen periods of disease transmission but also expand their geographic range. So that is, so this because of this, okay, that not only effect on a particular region, so because of this that is the disease transition to other regions of the world also. And as of course all of us knew that as the students and the teachers of economics, in most of the poor countries, the people spend most of their health care from their out of pocket, unlike in the rich countries. Whereas in case of the rich countries, 70 to 80% of the expenditure on health is supported by the government. But whereas in case of low income countries, lower middle income countries, so the majority of the expenditure by the households spent on the healthcare related expenditure is borne by from their own pocket. That is called as out of pocket expenditure from the household. Since the peoples are the poor people, they spent higher amount if there is a sudden climate hazard or and due to because of that, if there are some illness, so then again they have to spend more on that, and the countries as a whole world are the poorer countries, they have to spend more on the health expenditure. And also further related to this health related effects, again within the peoples, the impact of this climate change on the persons is not identical or similar. The children and the old age persons are especially at risk due to their limited mobility, vulnerability to infectious diseases, lower caloric and nutritional intake, and for older persons greater social isolation. So from this what we have noted is that, so the second important channel through which this climate change is health and mortality. So the health and mortality is also affected by the climate change, and within health, the mortality rate or the magnitude or the size of the effect of this climate change and the climate hazards on the people is not similar. There is again there is a disproportionate effect of this climate change on children and older, young children, and so on. So this is of course related to the second channel. The third one is the agricultural production and food prices. This is the third channel through which the climate change affects in the countries. Shifts in climatic conditions exert both direct and indirect effects on agricultural fields, aquaculture, livestock, and fisheries production. So these are the four important, the agriculture and agriculture related activities. So they are highly affected directly and indirectly by the climatic conditions. In regions other than those with low baseline temperatures, higher temperature will damage plant cells and reduce crop yields and adversely affect animal growth rates and dairy production, and increased frequency and intensity of the extreme weather events will diminish agriculture yield. So of course that has been observed even in Indian context from the last few years. So, and probably all of us knew that the agricultural production is almost stagnant, or especially the productivity in the agriculture sector is almost stagnant. So that productivity is almost stagnant. So one of the probably the reasons, or the most important reason among all the reasons, is this climate change. Because of this climate change, the agriculture productivity is stagnated from the last several years. That has been observed from this discussion. According to one of the estimates, by 2050, international producer food prices are expected to grow by an average of 20%. The food prices, producer food prices, expected to grow by 20%. And although the higher prices could benefit farmers, this gain may not be enough to offset drastically lower yields. So we know that because of increase in the prices, that benefits the agriculturists, but that could not benefit the agriculturists, or this benefit is not enough to offset the drastic decrease in the yields. So that is, the yields of the agricultural products also decreases rapidly, or more than increase in the food prices. In addition, higher food prices will put a strain on households that spend a significant proportion of their income on food. So the poor people, marginalized people, and other disadvantaged people spend most of their income on food. So if the food prices increases by 20%, so just to imagine, so the conditions are the type of effect of this increase in food prices on the livelihood of those marginalized persons. And this is the amount of money that's spent by the poor households in their total expenditure, and also compared to non-poor. So this, the first red line that represent the amount of the expenditure on food by the poor people in the different regions of the world, which is highest in case of the sub-Saharan Africa. It is equivalent to 60%. The households in sub-Saharan Africa spend 60% of their earned income on food items. So that's why. So even in case of South Asia, it is equivalent to around above 50%. That's why. So if there is an increase in the food price because of decrease in the yield in agriculture sector, that affects on the standard of living of peoples. And this is one more estimate. So based on the different scenarios, 10% increase, 50% increase, and 100% increase in the food prices, that could lead to a big increase in the extreme poverty in most of the countries. So that means from current to, for example, to the next few years, if the food prices increases by 10%, so the first line that so that is the first few one is negative. In case of few countries, in Cambodia, in China, in these two countries it is negative, not much. But whereas in all other countries except these two countries, you have seen a bar in the positive part. So and this the red one, a dark red one represent. So if the food prices increases or expected to increase by 100%, so then for example in Yemen Republic, okay, 35% increases the poverty. So that is the extreme poverty increases by 35% due to because of just increase in food prices. So this is the importance of the food price and increase in the food price and its effect on the standard of living and that is the poverty finally. That is the third channel. The fourth channel is related to labor and economic productivity. High temperatures and heat waves result in lower economic output in countries around the world. Production losses in climate sensitive industries, increased workplace accident risks, and heat related illnesses contribute partly to this phenomenon. So that is if there is an increase in the temperature and the heat waves, so that lowers the productivity of the people, lower the productivity of the production, and due to because of that the output is lowered. And studies have identified decreased labor productivity as a major factor affecting economic growth in majority of the countries. So why it is expected to decrease the output is if the output decreases, naturally the GDP will decrease. The growth rate of the GDP will decrease. So along with the several other factors, so the high temperature is one of the reason. And this curve that shows, so if it gets too hot, productivity falls. So it is measured horizontally in temperature. So if the temperature is 15 degrees Celsius, and if it increases to 20 degrees Celsius, initially there is an increase in productivity. But if beyond that increases 20 degrees Celsius, so the productivity declines, productivity falls. That's why the productivity falls after reaching a maximum level if the temperature increases beyond a threshold level of around 20 degrees Celsius. So this was an estimated and this diagram was taken based on the Seppepen, Fisk and Level study in 2006. So beyond these four important channels through which the climate change effects on the livelihoods of the people or the countries, there are also the climate change has several negative effects, and one among them probably is the migration. So we know that due to because of that disasters, due to because of the climate hazards, due to because of the heat waves and so on, and also due to because of the floods, the people migrate from one places to other place. So that of course not included in this discussion. That is the impact of climate change, global warming on the migration of the people or the movements of the people from one place to other place. So this is about the first part of our discussion, that is related to the channels through which climate change affects on the country's livelihood. So then we were discussed about agriculture, health, and the productivity. These are the important. Labor and productivity are the four important things. Then the determinants of the uneven impacts of the climate change, that is the disproportionate effect of the climate change. What determines the climate change is disproportionately effect on the different peoples. There are three important reasons are the determinants identified by the literature, which considered as the determinants of the disproportionate or uneven impacts of the climate change across the countries, within the country, and among the groups of the people or the peoples. The first one is the differences in exposure to climate hazards. Then their second one is their susceptibility or vulnerability to the damage caused by such hazards. And the third one is their ability to cope with the effects and the recover. So these are the three important determinants considered by the literature related to impact of climate change on the countries at the country level and the peoples at the micro level. So let us once again have a very brief discussion on these determinants. The first one is unequal exposure and impact across the countries. So the countries are not exposed equally to climate change. There is differences in the exposures of these countries to the climate change. Because of that unequal or the differences in the exposure, the climate change disproportionately affects on the countries, and that leads to inequality and poverty. A study by the Defenberg and Burke in 2019 find that from 1961 to 2010, higher temperatures improved economic growth in cool countries, most of which are developed countries, while they negatively affected the growth in warm countries, the most of the countries which are developing, because these developing countries are close to tropical region. So, but whereas those developed countries are located in the temperate zone, so hence in this 50 years, the study found that there is a positive effect of this temperature increase for the developed countries, but it has negatively impacted on the developing countries. The researchers also estimated that the ratio between the incomes, earlier we have already noted that the richest and poorest that has been increased to 25% larger. So it would be in a world without global warming. And the developing countries, including small islands, developing states, face significantly higher climate-related risk and have fewer resources for mitigation and adaptation than the developed countries. So this is the second exposure. One is related to the temperature because of the geographical location itself, the exposure is different. The second exposure is related to the mitigation and adaptation strategies to mitigate the problem of climate change and climate hazards. So again, there is unequalness among the countries because of the resources they have owned. We know that the developing countries or the poor countries, they have fewer resources compared to developed countries. That is another kind of exposure in terms of the resources. So many of these countries will find increasingly difficult to recover from worsening climate conditions and more extreme events. So since they have developing countries, poorer countries have fewer resources to mitigate the climate change or to adapt the strategies to reduce the climate related effects as hazards. So they are facing the problems because of the fewer resources. In fact, unless appropriate action is taken, climate change threatens to leave a substantial part of the world further behind. So countries in different regions suffer from different levels of exposure and susceptibility to the effects of climate change and possesses varying capacity to cope with them. So because of the wealth and the assets possessed by these countries. And just we have noted that the country location is one of the major factor, important determinant of the level of exposure. The mean temperatures are projected to increase in most land and ocean regions, with hot extremes in most inhabited regions becoming more frequent. The number of the hot days is projected to increase with the tropical regions affected most. So if the hot extremes increases, so normally that first effect on the tropical regions, so where the developing countries and the poorer countries are located. Additionally, increased heavy precipitation will affect certain regions, while some others, including semi-arid and areas in Mediterranean, South Africa, and northern Brazil, which face worsening drought and precipitation deficit. So even that the level of precipitation across the world because of the climate change, and even within a country across the region, as of course we have been observed for the last several years, is not unequal. So that's why the location of the country is one of the major determinant of the exposure. So because of that, there is an unequal, disproportionate effect of climate change across the countries. And of course, the next is again related to that exposure unequalness based on the location across the countries. And again, related to susceptibility, that is the vulnerability of the countries, and coping abilities are taken into account. So some countries which have assets, okay, to rehabilitate or to rebuild and so on, those are able to increase their climate risk conditions compared to other countries, so which have poorer resources. That's why, so though the climate hazard has been identified, observed in a particular country, so if that country has capacity to cope up with that problem, so that is only possible for the developed countries, but whereas for the developing countries, since they doesn't have any resources to cope with that particular problem, and hence they are very difficult for them to recover from these climate hazards. That is related to across the countries, and the same is also holds good within the countries. Within the country also, if you take Indian context, even within Indian context, all the regions within India are not equally exposed to climatic conditions or the climate change. So unequal exposures within the country also has been observed that. And again, within the country, the population groups are differs in their degree of exposure, susceptibility to damage, and their ability to cope up with this climate change. So that's why within the country, because of that is the weaker section, then the poor people, vulnerable population, so they are of course unequal exposure has been found in that regard. The income and asset levels influence their differences, and as do social networks and community resources. So that is these unequal exposures in terms of their income, in terms of the assets they hold by the people. So these found there is a difference. So because of the differences in the asset level of the income of the people, they are more vulnerable, are more susceptible, and due to the damage, and also the effects on the ability to cope with the climate change, and also along the social networks and the community resources. So the people living in poverty, as well as other population groups that are socio-economically vulnerable or disadvantaged, are particularly affected by this climate change, as we have noted several times. They are also get greater risk of death from climate change causes owing to their higher exposure and susceptibility and low access to adaptation tool. So this was a study observed in 2017. And more specifically related to the people living in poverty, again, the discussion is related to the exposures of these poor people, susceptibility to the damage by these two poor people, and the cope with the climate change. So if we want to study the effect of climate change on the poor people, we have to look into these three important determinants, as we have same observed across the countries or within the countries. The same is also holds good for the poor people. So that is, as just I have told you, that exposure. So because the disaster prone areas tend to be more affordable, people living in poverty are disproportionately exposed to climate change, feeding various cycle of poverty and exposure. That becomes a cycle, poverty, vicious cycle of poverty. So that vicious cycle of poverty, which we have been studied in earlier days because of the other reasons. But in recent years, probably the most important factor that is responsible of this vicious cycle of poverty of the poor people in any country, especially in the developing country, including India, might be, we should have to take into account the climate change might be the major determinant for this vicious cycle of poverty. So because of the exposure of these people or the poor people to the climate change. The poverty is indeed higher in marginal areas and other precarious locations that are prone to climate hazards despite general awareness of the related risks. And these locations include arid areas which are highly exposed to drought and often experience water scarcity, and the bottom of hill slopes which are prone to mudslides that are increasing in frequency. This is again the location of the poor people, So if they are located in that arid areas, that is the where they are fully depends upon the rainfall and so on for their agricultural activities, or depends upon the ecosystem related activities. So naturally, they are more prone to this type of climatic hazards, and that impacts on their livelihood. That is the first exposure to the poverty. So there are some studies. For example, in Bangladesh, many lower income households live in slums that tend to be located in low-lying areas. During Cyclone Alia in 2009, 1 in 4 poor households were affected by the storm, compared to 1 in 7 in non-poor households. So just to compare that. So that is 1 in 4. 25% of the poor households were affected. But whereas in case of the non-poor people, only 1 in 7. 1 in 7. So that is a disproportionate, unequal effect due to the exposure in the location. Similarly, in New Orleans, in the United States, a majority of the residents living in low-lying districts in 2005 were lower income households that suffered disproportionately during the Hurricane Katrina. So that is the location where they are living is one of the most important exposure to this climatic change. Okay, and this is the ecosystem based income explain most rural income in the tropical or the subtropical smallholder system. That is the amount of income they earn from the ecosystem based. So these are the quintiles. First to fifth quintiles in Latin America, South Asia, East Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Just observe that in almost all in these 4 regions of the world. So of course, where we found majority of the poor peoples are living in these regions of the world. So earlier we have noted that, for example, more than on the average 60% of their income is from eco-based activities. That's why any changes in the climate hazards severely affect on these peoples or the income of these peoples. And the second one is, so these peoples are the poor peoples are not just exposures in terms of their location to the climate hazards or the climate change, but also they are more vulnerable compared to the non-poor people. That is the susceptibility of these poor people is more compared to the non-poor people. So differences in housing quality, this is the differences. The local infrastructure, including whether adoption strategies in the place, is a major determinant of their susceptibility. Overall, the assets of those who are impoverished are more fragile than those of their wealthier neighbors. So this is, of course, exposures and the vulnerability of the poor and the non-poor people. Just observe this. So in almost all the countries that comes under this study, that shows that, so that yellow line or the yellow bar, that is higher compared to the dark blue one, which indicates that so the poor peoples are more exposure, and also the vulnerability. If you just observe the vulnerability, the second pane of or the second part of this graph, okay, you have more vulnerability of these poor people. So that's why the poor peoples are more exposed to climatic hazards, and also the more vulnerable are their susceptibility is higher. The same, of course, the same has been identified by the many studies across the countries of the world and also within the countries of the world. And the third one again is related to the ability to cope and recover. So as we are already noted that, so as a country, if the country is poor, since with as a fewer resources, it is very difficult for a poor country to cope with this climatic hazard. The same is also holds good for the poor people or the people living in the poverty. So that has been discussed under this title, ability to cope and recover. And the face and this, of course, these are the all of them. They face only the negative consequences of the climate change. Are the poor people always they are affected negatively by this climatic change. Among other challenges, they have limited capacity to relocate to safer areas, build structurally stronger homes, or pay for the cost of adoption and coping methods. As we already noted that, so why these peoples are more susceptible because of the material wealth they have. So that is the first affected by the climatic hazards, and since they have fewer resources in their hand, including financial resources, so for them it is very difficult to relocate to the safer areas and so on. So this is related to the ability to cope and recover from the climatic hazards by the poorer people. And the last but not the least is the policy options, and including IPCC. So that is the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, a institute that comes under UNO, and other the studies. They have identified the few important options, policy options, to mitigate this climate change, or the mitigate the problem of climate and climatic hazards, and also suggested some policies or the strategies to adapt. So since already we have 3:10, so we have only 5 minutes. So hence I don't want to get into much related to that. So as just I have told you that the first policy that has been suggested by many of the studies at the international or within the national level are mitigation policies. That is how to mitigate the problem of climate change, global warming. So if the global warming is not mitigated, so then it is very difficult for